So thank you, Arthur. That was splendid and hard to live up to, I must say. Also to our organizers here, that was one of the most charming introductions, I have to say, to a conference in general. This surroundings here are in and of themselves not only evocative of, as it turns out, a lengthy utopian engagement because of the friendship with Erasmus, but also the fact that this was German police headquarters during the Second World War, a dystopian note as well, which point I will return to in due course. So I'm also very grateful to the organizers of the conference as such, to Christoph, to Michael, to Senya, for not only kindly picking me up, but keeping me informed all the way along as to what we would be doing here. So there's one minor note of correction, however, it is of note, so to speak. My title, Utopia at 500, A Final Reckoning. There was in the original version of this, and in my written version, a question mark at the end of the sentence. This is of some moment, as you might imagine, because without the question mark, the finality of the judgment as such would be presumed, whereas at least with the question mark, we leave to you, the audience, the most serious issue hanging, the relevance of the concept today. So, are we today celebrating this concept, or should we indeed be celebrating it? Or is this perhaps a wake, a somber and funereal acknowledgement of the passing of a brave, perhaps impetuous, but nonetheless inspirational idea, great in its time, but now defunct? As a proposition, utopias had a good run, 500 years. Liberalism hasn't made it nearly that long, has it? And it's in danger too. But perhaps its shelf life, utopias, is now exhausted. Perhaps as an ideal of human improvement, its limitations have been reached, and its moral and emotional content drained. Perhaps, as the great Victorian art critic John Ruskin once said, Thomas More's Jeu d'Esprit was indeed, really, the most mischievous book ever written. Perhaps then we need another concept to take utopia's place. So we may praise utopia today, but also bury it, or perhaps herald its half-millennial arising from the grave. I return to this theme too. Whether then we should lament or grimace, shed a salutary tear, or contemptuously slam the coffin lid shut, will depend, of course, on what we think we see before us. 500 years ago, in 1516, there appeared in Antwerp a little Latin book, which we now familiarly refer to as Utopia. As both the no place and the good place, and eventually perhaps also the place one should not go, the dream which becomes a nightmare when we try to realize it, utopia has become inscribed in our vocabulary and our ideas. It means, of course, many things to many people, yet few would deny the power of the ideal. So let us today consider briefly how this came about, by looking firstly at the book and its times, and then the development of the concept to which it gave birth. I then want to consider utopia's friends and enemies, to unveil one skeleton from the family closet, dystopia, and then finally to ask what future, if anything, the concept holds for us today. And I think the younger one tends to be the more this latter issue is first and foremost the key problem, what of the future? So, the man and his ideas. Firstly, we turn then to Sir or Saint Thomas and his ideas. As most of you are doubtless aware, the text Utopia is presented to us in the form of a dialogue in which the central narrative about a society called Utopia appears in Book 2, when the travels of Raphael Hythloday are related to a rather skeptical Thomas More, and which then we immediately ask, is the real More in this schizophrenic division? More commences Utopia with an account of the desperation of the poor in the England of his day in Book 1. We're quickly made aware by the mention of Amerigo Vespucci that recent travelers to the New World, as Europeans view it, have brought back fantastic but compelling tales of their discoveries. Some hinted that conditions were akin to the golden age of Greek mythology, the very opposite, thus, of the contemporary England described in Book 1. More would have known, we suspect, of Peter Martyr d'Anghiera's description of the natives of Cuba as having community of goods, and there were other assorted rumors of this type. Few would, however, today describe Utopia's inhabitants as noble savages. But Utopia does appear to be just such a tale. It projects an island lying somewhere in the equatorial regions, founded both by shipwreck and the wise design of the great mariner Utopias many centuries earlier. When we recall that Columbus thought that the earthly paradise lay somewhere just beyond the mouth of the Orinoco River, what is today Brazil, More's postulate seems, if anything, less fantastic than Columbus's own supposition. The constitution and mores of Utopia appear to owe more, however, to classical antiquity than to the customs of the Aboriginal Americans. Yet their peculiarities betray three features which some contemporaries supposed did define native life in the so-called New World, and which have been attached to our idea of utopia ever since. These are, firstly, community of goods. Then, an apparent contempt, I stress apparent, for gold and silver and ostentatious pride generally. And finally, of course, the abolition of money, the source of all evil. The discovery of the New World, from one viewpoint, could indicate the turning away from apostolic communism as a tragic error for humanity. As we're all aware, the travel literature which served as a backdrop to More's text, most notably the tradition associated with Sir John Mandeville's travels of the mid-14th century, was replete with fantastic lands. The names More gives us, firstly to, of course, Utopia itself, then to its capital, Amarot, meaning obscure or unknown, suggests a satire upon this tradition of fantastic travel. But then the introduction of Vespucci returns us to a realistic set of presumptions. Yet Utopia, far from being the perfect society with which it is still far too often confused, is not indeed even the best possible society given the prevalence of war and slavery. While the ethos of friendship, which defines Utopia, is always commendable, this I think is the central theme many readers take from the text, it's by no means so obvious that communism is the answer to the woes of England as described in Book 1, where More laments that the poor are being hung en masse as great landlords drive them off the land to enclose the commons for highly profitable sheep raising. This is the 16th century equivalent of austerity today. Communism is a theme which appears to bring utopians close to apostolic Christianity, or to being more Christian, in other words, than More's own contemporaries. But communism is also, on balance, what More finds least plausible in Hythlodae's tale. How, he asks near the end, can these utopians really be motivated without the ownership of property? And if this regime of common endeavor works here, More hints as the book closes as to his skepticism as to whether Europeans could ever live this way, converting from their lives of opulence and the love of pleasure to this superior Platonic and Christian ideal. But the vision remains to More a tantalizing and fascinating one. To many modern readers, however, the two islands of Britain and Utopia have too little in common to imagine that the model is meant to be imitated. Utopia has, of course, several other leading themes which merit brief mention. Its inhabitants spend their time divided between 54 almost identical towns and cultivation in the countryside. They dress, eat, work, and behave in remarkably similar ways. They combat vice by a regime of near complete transparency, leaving no space in which crime and vice might flourish. In Utopia, we are told in a famous passage, there are no wine bars, no pubs, no whorehouses. There are no opportunities for wickedness, no hiding places. There is no scope for conspiring in secret. They are always, this is still more, under the observation of their fellow citizens and have no choice but either to work as hard as the next person or else engage in respectable pastimes. So, of course, too, we cannot travel outside our neighborhood without passports. We must wear the same plain clothes. We must exchange our houses every 7 years. We cannot avoid labor. We must all go to bed at the same time, 8 p.m., and never under penalty of slavery with someone else's wife or husband. In More's time, for much of the population, such restraints would not, of course, have appeared unduly unreasonable. For modern readers, however, Utopia appears to rely upon a relentless transparency, severe regulation, and the almost utter curtailment of privacy. In both its external and internal relations, then, it seems, perhaps paradoxically, to us perilously dystopian. Utopia, then, is not really a fun place. It is a safe place. It offers repose, but the price is restraint. Moreover, of course, Utopia remains an imperial power. When overpopulated, it sends out colonies, seizing the uncultivated land of indigenous peoples and driving out, I quote from the text, any who resist them. This part of the text is not often recalled. Well-paid mercenaries keep enemies at bay. Here, the Utopians' much vaunted contempt for gold, standing starkly in contrast with the great value their treasure has when expended on slaying their enemies, which gives us a rather different view of their attitude towards gold, indeed. Utopia's peace and plenitude now seem to rest upon war, empire, and the ruthless suppression of others. Or in other words, Utopia rests upon other people's dystopia. And there are, of course, limits to their generosity. They're tolerant in most matters of religion, but not for those who would deny the immortality of the soul. Nonetheless, this is perhaps just all part of the entertaining story. Generations of scholars have reached no fixed opinion as to how seriously More meant us to take on these themes. There is much jest and satire mixed up in the text. There is little doubt that More regarded much of utopian life as ideal, but much more than he thought that much of this was attainable by most of us. Yet More's intentions and a close contextual reading of Utopia are perhaps secondary to most students today by comparison with the influence of its central ideas. The most common reading of the text, from Vasco de Quiroga, who adopted Utopia as a blueprint to establish a community near Mexico City in the 1530s, to Robert Southey in the early 19th century, to Karl Kautsky 2 generations later and beyond, the most common reading of the text has been the realistic one, in which Hitler Day serves as the prophet of the communist ideal. The reasons for this are not hard to discern. The success of Utopia coincided with a decline in the belief that the terrestrial paradise actually lay somewhere in this world. As any of you medievalists or modernists know, it was located physically on maps of this period, usually in the Middle East or Near East, but sometimes, as with Columbus, in Southern America. This idea also overlapped with repeated eruptions of the sentiments, often assuming the form of an hysterical egalomania, desire for equality, which we associate today with millenarianism, the prospect of Christ's return, the overthrow of Satan, and the establishment of divine rule. These ideas, of course, have in turn a lengthy pedigree. The millenarian wing of the utopian ideal, the idea which I think we need most closely to try to disassociate from Utopia, dates as far back at least as the 12th century vision of Joachim of Fiore, who divides history into 3 stages, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, and for whom the third paradisical period, where there would be no work, wealth, or poverty, and no food, would involve each human being evolving into a spiritual being. In 1936, Karl Mannheim, and in 1947, Norman Cohn, author of 2 of the most important key secondary works. Those of you who are thinking of what to assign your students, I always take these as a starting point. These 2 authors, Mannheim and Cohn, were amongst the first to identify the 16th century Anabaptists with the secularization of millenarian ideas, heralding the great utopian schemes and movements of the 20th century. In between, of course, the 17th century echoed constantly with utopian schemes, plans, ideas, sentiments, from Bacon and Winstanley to Harrington, Bellers, and St. Pierre, and so on. In the 18th century, the belief in an original equality, the single most important idea for understanding what utopia is about, was powerfully reinforced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in particular. Then, in the 19th century, faith in a future heaven for believers also began to wane, and with it millenarianism, which had thus necessarily, according to my reading of the sentiment, to be secularized. The desire for a much better state for humanity now became accordingly naturally fixated upon the real present and the real future, on this world alone. Now, as Henri de Saint-Simon famously proclaimed, the golden age of mankind lay, quote, not behind us but before. It lies in the perfection of the social order. Utopia thus came to embody the principle of equality formerly represented by Christianity. There's a reasonable case here for seeing what Reinhard Koselleck termed the temporalization of utopia, the metamorphosis of utopia into the philosophy of history. I'm continuing from Koselleck, where the imagined perfection of the formerly spatial counterworld is temporalized, this in the 18th century, as a key stage, Koselleck presumes, in millenarian secularization. I think this is a very persuasive argument. Yet there remained, and still perhaps remains, much confusion between the millennium and utopia. One example only. The leading communist in the French Revolution, Gracchus, as he styled himself, Babeuf, aimed to abolish, I quote, all frontiers, fences, walls, locks on doors, all disputes, trials, all theft, murder, all crime, all tribunals, prisons, gallows, torture. Continues, jealousy, insatiability, pride, deceit, duplicity, finally all vice. All would be abolished. A classic millennial vision of boundless felicity in the phrase of Richard Landis, who is the author of a book about millenarianism, which again I would commend to you. Utopia here is a condition, however, as we understand it, of bounded felicity, of restraint, and perhaps first and foremost, of course, of self-restraint. What the millennial shockwave, as Landis calls it, of the French Revolution shared with utopia was a suddenly exploding egalitarianism, described a bit later on in terms of the mass hysteria of the crowd by the great sociologist, although he's hardly in vogue today, Gustave Le Bon, which reverberates down through European history for the next 2 centuries. So let's now consider some of the more notable moments in this process. In the early modern period, as we've seen, utopian ideas we might conceive of today was still often identified with the provision of security and stability, excuse me, through the creation of institutions which once formed become immutable. Satires aside, and those are interesting too, those 17th and 18th century literary utopias, which reflected More's aims, seriously tended to regulate luxury through sumptuary laws restricting personal consumption and adornment, and by limiting property ownership in land especially. In Britain in particular, many literary texts reflected the aims of a republican tradition defined in this epoch, specifically by the works of James Harrington, whose Oceana of 1656 will be known to some of you. Utopian republicanism, as I call it, had by 1750 become a distinctive position on the spectrum of political ideas, going beyond the notion of an agrarian law, which limits the amount of landed property we can hold, to community of goods, what we today call communism. But in practice, authors of fictional utopias toyed with a great many variants on these themes, including land nationalization. The most transparent and rigidly controlled of these schemes generally, however, have little appeal to modern readers, who expect, now post-91 anyway, that utopia and liberty are somehow natural partners in the first instance, and disagree fundamentally with what might seem to be a key historical premise that liberty is a just price to pay for equality. The French Revolution, of course, represents the first great watershed in the modern development of the utopian idea into precisely this direction. Here, a republican constitution accompanied an ideology based upon the rights of man, which some have assumed possessed itself a markedly utopian dimension. I'd be surprised if such discussions haven't occurred in this very room. The shift towards a much more radical idea of equality, which the Jacobin coup of 1792 produced, also echoed the central theme that we identify with the tradition as such. And beyond this, there were the new massive popular festivals, an ethos of increasingly social transparency, and much else that, by reflecting on what Moore is doing, we can see do echo his themes. But here there loomed too the possibility that utopian aims might have dystopian results, with the emergence of the Jacobin terror under Robespierre, 1793 to 4. But the revolution in general also indicated that crucial trend towards seeing utopian aims as realizably imminently in a future to come, rather than as being the discovered vestiges of a lost golden age or a state of nature or a tropical paradise or a future heaven to be achieved. Utopia had now become Uchronia, the good time which is not yet, but upon which we are advancing, which is just over our own horizon. The modern concept of progress, an indefinite process of becoming better and more perfect, our own later modern most cherished idea, though sadly, I think on its deathbed today, had emerged by this time. Now we would remake mankind, not in the image of original sin, but in that of millenarian felicity. The story of Utopia's advancement from this time is a familiar one to most of us here, for we are its adherents and beneficiaries to an impressive degree. The main fork in this road came, of course, with the Revolution of 1848 and even more that of 1917, when the communist version of progress finally came to offer itself as the great alternative to the supposed free market variant offered by liberalism. A general course of increasing perfectibility through opulence, the extension of life, the remaking of the human body, and the relief of pain might clearly fly today to our students as a utopian program. But the enhanced Morean variant of this, achieving all these things and adding the elimination of crime, for instance, was clearly inherited by Marxism. This became, of course, the dominant oppositional ideology of the 20th century. Even before the Bolshevik Revolution, however, the immense controversy surrounding Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward of 1887 indicated that other collectivist variants on the management of modern economies could give Marx a run for his money in the ideological arena. Marx himself, of course, denied that his own schemes were in any sense utopian, and Marxists still get hot under the collar when you suggest that they are. Marx castigated his socialist predecessors for refusing to harness the proletariat to the revolutionary means required to introduce the new system. But in its expectation of dramatic improvements in human behavior, engineered by a collectivist organization of property, Marx, in fact, merits the utopian title, if anything, rather more than those who suppose such achievements might be workable in a small-scale community. And even Marx remained enchanted in his final years by the prospect that modern communism might indeed have some antecedents in the Russian Mir or in other forms of primitive communalism. Nonetheless, it was precisely in such communities that the 19th century saw utopia unfolding. To spend a day in one, most notably in the Furious Femme Austère, was in principle to encounter a varied routine of multiple forms of work adjusted to our aptitudes. There would be 5 or so meals, cultural activities, and a court of love assuring us all a guaranteed minimum of sexual gratification akin to a living wage. The Owenites, the Cabotistes, not to say the Shakers, Etzlerites, Harmonites, and 100 other strands of religious sectarians, offered many variants on these themes, though Fourier doubtless promised more fun, probably than all the rest put together. All, however, offered security, a Gemeinschaft variant on community, or what I call enhanced sociability, by contrast to the increasing alienated, insecure urban society which is rapidly emerging in later 19th century Europe. In this vision of the idealized village or small town, there is often joy, celebration, conviviality, creativity, even individuality, not merely security, equality, and a sense of greater community. Trust and familiarity are permitted because the scale remains small. Politics remain personal because no coercive state is necessary. William Morris, amongst others, would imagine that even nations might be remade along the lines of such principles. And yet, of course, with notable exceptions, the Amish, the Hutterites, 2 million Mennonites, many of these communitarian efforts failed, often dramatically quickly. But the exceptions here also prove that communism does work on a small scale. So the problem isn't communism, as we'll see. The lack of bloodshed generally in so-called utopian socialism validates such experiments to a considerable degree, while hinting that the application of their principles to a large-scale, highly industrialized urban context at a national level may well prove their breaking point and their undoing. Both Bellamy and, of course, H.G. Wells nonetheless projected national and world states respectively, in which both technological innovation, change, and particularly in Wells's case, individuation, were combined with the earlier goals of Utopia. Their visions proved immensely influential in the decades from the 1880s to 1914, when the progress of the civilized world in general suddenly came to a crashing halt. So, to Utopia's friends and enemies. From 1917 to the end of the 20th century, the battle lines defined by Utopia were of world historical significance. Most of the 20th century's idealism was invested in what turned out to be the colossal failure of the Bolshevik Revolution. Enslavement to socialist machines turned out to be no better than servitude to their capitalist counterparts. Soviet apparatchiks, and their Polish counterparts, no doubt, were as callous as capitalist managers and less efficient. Party members were less the perfect specimens of angelic millennial man and woman than a cliquish nouveau riche of privileged bureaucrats. As the great anarchist Michael Bakunin had warned, popular control over coercive states was rapidly lost. Already, with Marx, notionally a Democrat, the idea of a legitimate political opposition and a multi-party system became questionable. With Lenin, Marx's promise of a democratic road to communist society was abandoned in favor of the dictatorship of the party over the proletariat, and then, of course, in Stalin's hands, of the dictatorship of one individual over the party in turn. It is now indisputable, I think, that Marxism assumed the form of a political and scientific religion, with its saints, liturgy, sacred texts, and leader worship. Lenin, and even more his followers and Chekist enforcers, quickly took all the property and all the educated to be their enemies, and aimed, indeed, quite early on in the revolution, at their physical extermination. The Bolshevik utopia came to prioritize industry over humanity. This became the inner meaning of scientific socialism. This becomes a very bad joke seen from this point of view. Many socialists, George Orwell would later complain, came to see, I quote, the idea of mechanical progress, not merely as a necessary development, but as an end in itself, a kind of religion. The attainment of communist modernity, moreover, quickly came to be seen as entailing a human cost, which its proponents were all too willing to concede to meet the scale of their aspirations. To modernize Russia, then in the 30s, then China after 1949, was seen by their leaders as worth the life of millions, many, many millions. Possessed by a higher truth, or within sight of achieving the final end, the stage of communist society, the party, like the 12th century antinomian Waldensian elect, or perfecti before them, claimed the right to act in any way which would hasten its attainment. This state of grace and absolution, a self-possessed calm in the eye of the millenarian storm, which permitted any means to achieve this end, was probably the most destructive mentality of all those which Marxism fostered. And so, perhaps 80 million died between 1917 and 1980 or so, striving for a paradise which never arrived. An uncharitable reader or historian might reckon that the slavery in More's Utopia was in fact only met by its logical corollary in the slave states of Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot. Many others, amongst them critics like Friedrich von Hayek and Karl Popper, have assumed that it is the search for utopia itself, conceived as a more perfect state of society, which induced such bloodshed. Utopia here, in the eyes of these critics, is a closed society, a repressive society, a society demanding a unanimity which cannot be achieved in principle without violence. It produces, in turn, a fatuous ersatz, forced sociability of notional comradeship, which the famous Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski calls compulsory solidarity. Trust, that crucial attribute of utopia, was eradicated here and replaced by universal suspicion. I quote very briefly from one of the great diarists of the Stalin epoch, Nadezhda Mandelstam. The loss of mutual trust is the first sign of the atomization of society in dictatorships of our type, and that is just what our leaders wanted. So More's transparency becomes Orwell's telescreen. More's virtues require the gulag for enforcement. Pol Pot indeed succeeds in abolishing money and also in killing a third of the population of Cambodia. Thomas More, the skeptic, doubting whether community of goods was actually viable, trumps Thomas More, the idealist, speaking through Raphael Hithloday and hinting that it might be. In the 19th and 20th centuries, then, the case against utopia was bolstered by at least three other modern developments. Firstly, what we often today refer to as dystopia came increasingly to be seen as potentially imminent in the growing role of technology and machinery in our lives. Samuel Butler hints at this in Erewhon of 1872, William Morris in his various works, the robots, of course, in Karel Čapek's famous play R.U.R. of 1920 would drive the metal point home relentlessly. Then, most evidently in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World of 1932, the spectre emerges of an essentially hedonistic mass utopia, complete with mandatory promiscuity to inhibit personal attachment. Here, however, behavioral manipulation by propaganda would condition humanity to collective identity, a theme brilliantly satirized in Evgeny Zamyatin's We of 1924 and partially reworked in V.F. Skinner's Walden II of 1948. The following year, of course, most famously, George Orwell would present to the world the most polished and emotionally penetrating, indeed disturbing, of the anti-totalitarian dystopias, 1984, which remains today the most penetrating critique, I think, of the Stalinist mentality of the epoch. Finally, commencing in the same period, the specter of environmental catastrophe, overpopulation, and resource depletion began to loom upon us in the late 1950s, early 1960s. By the late 20th century, it seemed as if humanity might well be facing imminent disaster. In the second decade of the 21st century, this seems a near certainty. We have, it seems, survived the catastrophe of totalitarianism only to fall prey to scenarios which appear even more overwhelming. Poor utopia, whose hopes are dashed, but even more, poor humanity, which has gambled so much and lost everything. Such nightmares nonetheless clearly indicate the centrality of dystopia to our own times. Dystopian literature may well have fallen short in the face of so much horror. I'm thinking here in the sense in particular of Auschwitz down the road, in describing the genocides of the 20th century. But now, particularly where science and technology are central, The projections that literary dystopias have to offer are, I think, of crucial importance to us. The new, they warn us, is not always the better. Progress is not always automatic and may be dangerous. What benefits the few may harm the many. Machines may devour us. So may corporations or revolutionaries. Hurtling towards an uncertain but clearly perilous future, we need visions of alternatives, even utopias, to delineate which paths suggest the greater and which the lesser evils. We need the long view, not the short-termism which politics and the desire for ever more instantaneous gratification force upon us. We face later in this century a near-apocalyptic scenario of overpopulation and climate change. Both of these interconnected processes are accelerating so rapidly, and so little is being done to retard them, that there is no reason to expect that they will be halted. Here, dystopia races ahead of utopia so far as to leave the latter gasping in insignificance. So, the last section then, the final reckoning with the question. These reflections leave the friends of utopia, and I would, believe it or not, after all this so far, include myself in this count, with some mighty threats to reckon with. Indeed, the three problems of the failure of More's original scheme, the threat of mechanization to humanity, and environmental disaster would seem to put paid to utopian speculation as such. Instead, it might be contended, all the possible futures lying before us are bleak and dystopian, none pleasant, none better than the best we have achieved so far, which is, from a utilitarian viewpoint, the social democratic welfare state, and many worse than the other. The most powerful promise of all, moreover, that of a millennial remaking of mankind, the construction of a new humanity, a new human nature, out of the crucible of revolution, seems to have failed utterly. Here we see connections between Jacobin experiments, echoing the natural sciences, to create a new egalitarian man and woman, l'homme régénéré, to Victor Frankenstein's creature, to eugenics, to the genetic and artificial remaking of the human body with which we are so preoccupied today. The body to one side, however, the moral and mental aspects of this rebaptism have fallen well short of expectations. Just as once the Americas were conquered, its inhabitants turned out to be not so very different from the rest of us, so too new Soviet man and Soviet woman were forged in the Stalinist furnace, and they too turned out to look remarkably like us, if somewhat the worse for wear. From this, we have learned, perhaps, that utopia is not the search for perfectibility, which is a theological quest. Utopia orders fallen humanity, and the zeal of both religion and political religion is one of its greatest enemies. Here, then, we see why the confusion between utopia and the millennium has proven to have such consequence. There's a good case, then, to be gloomy here. Yet pessimism, we might say, also has its advantages, which the Blockian school of utopian studies, with its mandatory optimism and insistence on eternal hope, echoing an official adolescent ideology in Leninism, tends to neglect. A realistic assessment of where we're going might indeed well be the only way anything like utopia could ever be achieved. If things look bleak, we ought to say so. Historians in particular are truth-sayers first and foremost. If hope then results, well, so much the better. But it cannot precede analysis or replace it. If you just want feel-good assurance, go to Hollywood or go to church. Yet we're all aware that gloom, too, has its limits. In the past several years, we've witnessed a number of populist democratic revivals of various types, which suggest that enthusiasm for substantial political change may yet once again lurk just beneath the surface of everyday life. If we instance the Syriza party in Greece, Podemos in Spain, the Occupy movement, the surprising degree of support Bernie Sanders' socialist principles have witnessed in the US, a common thread clearly runs throughout all of these movements. All acknowledge that the social democratic consensus achieved in Europe after World War II with its mixed economy of market and public provision of key services, remains the most attractive social model available to us. All indicate that the neoliberal assault on the welfare state, in which the privatization, I speak here from a British point of view, of course, even of health provisions, is driven by a rabid antipathy to the state as such. But perhaps this model is reaching its limits. These factors all point, I think, also to a generational gap as large and as resented as that which produced the youth rebellions of the 1960s. Millions are becoming aware that the agenda of austerity cuts only masks massive tax evasion through corporate profit transfers and tax havens. The sums involved here are so large as to negate the need for any cuts in social services at all. In Britain, corporate tax evasion, not individual, but corporate, costs about £80 billion per year, easily enough to avoid all austerity cuts to the existing welfare state, while some 15 to 20 trillion pounds, 1,000 billion that is held in tax havens worldwide, completely free of tax, which, if legitimately taxed, would generate a revenue of between 120 and 230 billion pounds per annum. And we can't touch this money, of course. The willingness of entire economies, notably Greece's, to be held hostage to the IMF and World Bank ideologies promoting just such a neoliberal privatization agenda may also finally be reaching its end. Yet we face a momentous shift in global social wealth, which is concentrated vastly more in the hands of the few than ever before. And this increasing power, of course, blocks all efforts to reform the system. These not uncontroversial observations indicate that Europe, in particular, having fled as a refugee from totalitarianism, reached the shores of Utopia in the 1950s and 1960s. The provision of old age pensions, unemployment benefits, paid substantial holidays, shorter working hours, gender workplace equality, a relatively flat pay differential between management and labor, all made up the mundane utopia of the post-war settlement. These measures created the space for that hedonism which masquerades as the height of humanity's aspirations, and to whose deficiencies we are often all too blind. Looking back 500 years, we would not want to say that this is as good as it gets, or the best humanity can do. For we can be kinder, more generous, more sociable. We can redesign cities, neighborhoods, and towns to make a better life possible. We can teach our children that sociability is preferable to the aggressive selfishness which a brutish conservatism and mammon worship commend to us. But on this scale, the utopia of the welfare state was nonetheless a mighty achievement. It represents just how successful the idea of utopia as a blueprint, rather than merely a vague dream, can be. The specter of its abandonment and its plunder by ravenous corporations ought to fill us with both dread and anger. When millions echo these sentiments, we will resist the loss of this utopia, and with sufficient effort, we might well recreate it and more. Beyond this, there will lie future challenges to any supposition of peace, prosperity, and equality. As we've seen, overpopulation and environmental destruction are likely to wreak havoc on any such vision towards the closing decades of this century. And yet here, ironically, we might well find that utopia returns full circle, and that the only way to end the world's most pressing problems involves exactly that classical Mauryan regime of regulation, which restrains and retrains our natural desires, but yet at the same time perhaps curtails many of the freedoms the 19th and 20th century came to cherish. No utopist has yet arisen from amongst us to proclaim this vision. No one stands up at this point. There's no reason here to disagree with George Orwell, who wrote in 1948, "The most encouraging thing about revolutionary activity is that although it always fails, it always continues. The vision of a free world of free and equal human beings living together in a state of brotherhood. In one age, it is called the kingdom of heaven. In another, the classless society. It never materializes, but the belief in it never dies out." But this belief needs once again to assume a concrete form. We must cease to imagine that the wolf will lie down with the lamb, that milk and honey will flow, that the pearly gates of Jerusalem will swing open to reveal streets of gold and walls of jasper. The millennium is dead. Utopia is not. Perfection and the moral rebaptism of humanity are dead. The modest vision of a good life and a long life, available to all but with restrained numbers, is not dead. But to counter nightmares, dreams are insufficient. We need plans, proposals, and blueprints. Utopia's great function is to animate us to provide visions of a long-term future. So in the spirit of Thomas More, let us rethink the century before us and see whether a better fate than history seems ready to deliver us can result from the effort. Thank you very much.